Joining us now is Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland. He also sits on the Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, you heard Marco Rubio this morning making the case as to why a big motivating factor in this was about oil. But let me actually play for you what Donald Trump said yesterday when he was talking about oil throughout the entire news conference. Take a listen to the number of times he referenced it.
The oil business in Venezuela, oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, the oil infrastructure. Venezuela unilaterally seized and sold American oil industry, massive oil, Venezuelan oil, to rebuild the oil infrastructure, the oil companies. We're going to get the oil flowing the way it should be. They stole our oil. Oil is very dangerous. We're in the oil business. We'll be selling oil. We'll be selling large amounts of oil. We'll have the greatest oil companies in the world.
Senator, I guess my question to you is, do you have any doubt that this operation was about anything other than accessing Venezuelan oil for American oil companies?
None whatsoever. This is all about oil. We all remember, Donald Trump first claiming that he was against the war in Iraq from the beginning, which wasn't true. But what he did say about the war in Iraq was, you know what, we should have at least grabbed their oil. This is all about Venezuelan oil. Donald Trump doesn't give a damn about free and fair elections in Venezuela. He doesn't care about the Venezuelan people. All you have to do is read their national security strategy, and they threw all of that overboard. Nor has this ever been about preventing drugs from getting to the United States. We all support stopping drugs coming from the United States, but we also know that the fentanyl is not coming from Venezuela. We know the president pardoned the former president of Honduras who'd been convicted on drug charges. This has been about getting his hands, America's hands, on Venezuela's oil for American oil companies and Trump's billionaire buddies. That's what it's about, just as the rest of his foreign policy is really organized about delivering for himself, his family, and his billionaire buddies.
Senator, one other thing that this could be about in my conversations with legal and constitutional experts is the Alien Enemies Act. Of course, you've spoken out forcefully about this administration's attempted use of that. They have sent people without due process to a brutal prison in El Salvador that you have visited. And the concern here is that if they are able to say, well, we are now at war with Venezuela, or we are going to be at war with Cuba or with Mexico and all the other places that we heard members of the administration mention yesterday, that will give them the legal justification that they need to invoke the Alien Enemies Act and then continue doing what we saw done to people like Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Are you at all concerned that at least for figures like Stephen Miller, that's the actual domestic endgame here?
Well, Antonia, I'm always worried about this administration, the Trump administration, and Stephen Miller concocting big lies to justify the actions they want to take. We've seen that from the beginning. Of course, they flirted with the idea of applying the Alien Enemies Act early on. The courts have made it clear that they didn't really believe that was a plausible argument. The DNI, I mean, the National Intelligence Director, they said early on that there was no issue of like a Venezuelan invasion through alien enemies. So they may try that. That will again be an issue for the courts. But look, there's no end to the lies that this administration tells the American people to try to justify what they're doing. Just as this whole issue of interdicting drugs has been a cover story for the real story, which is getting their hands on Venezuela's oil for the oil companies here in the United States.
What do you make, Senator, about the ambiguity and the confusion right now that the United States has left in Venezuela about who's running that country? We've been trying to kind of ascertain over the past 24 hours as to who's in charge. Obviously, right now in Venezuela, the vice president, according to the National Assembly and their constitution, will assume power on a temporary basis. But it didn't seem that the United States had a very clear idea of who was going to be in charge and whether or not it makes sense that you just remove Maduro but keep the entire regime still intact if you are concerned about the well-being of Venezuelans and the millions of Venezuelans who they claim are oppressed under Nicolas Maduro and his regime.
Well, look, the president doesn't care about the Venezuelan people. What Donald Trump wants is somebody in power in Venezuela who will do what Donald Trump says, especially with respect to the oil. And so far, the vice president has indicated that she is strongly opposed to the action the United States has taken. You know, whether that's the full story or not, we don't know yet. You mentioned the defense minister. He's been a Maduro loyalist. The interior minister has been a Maduro loyalist. So we don't really know where this is going to end, which is why Donald Trump did leave open the idea of more American boots on the ground going forward, even though people like Secretary Rubio and others have tried to, say that's just not true, but at the same time leave open that flexibility, which is why we're going to pursue again in the United States Senate a war powers resolution. I mean, the president says that we may send more troops in. We need to have Congress vote on that.
Senator, in 2019, Fiona Hill testified in front of lawmakers about a very strange swap arrangement that she alleged had been proposed between the Trump administration and Russians. Basically, that the Russians were going to ask the United States to get out of Ukraine. And if you do that, we'll get out of the way in Venezuela. Do you look back at that testimony now with a fresh perspective or a fresh set of eyes? And are you at all concerned that there may be other swaps on the table here, for example, China and Taiwan?
Well, I'm very concerned. And just going back to the Trump national security strategy that was unveiled a couple weeks ago, it's very clear that it throws overboard the whole idea of a rule-based order. In other words, the rule of law, human rights, promotion of democracy, respect for sovereignty. And it replaces it with this new Monroe Doctrine, where essentially Trump is saying, look, the United States will be able to have its way in our hemisphere. But the implication, of course, is that Putin can have his way in his neighborhood, which explains why Donald Trump has essentially been throwing the Ukrainian people, under the bus from the beginning. He sees that territory as being sort of Putin's backyard. And the same holds true with President Xi and China's relationship with Taiwan. So, yes, I think we should all be very worried, because essentially what Trump is doing is throwing out the idea of any universal rules of the game that we're going to play by in the post-World War II order. It's never been perfect, and the United States has never been perfect. But the notion that we're going to go to gunboat diplomacy in the Western Hemisphere and sort of let others do what they want in the rest of the world, I think is a recipe for disaster and certainly will undermine American interests around the world.
Let me go back, if I can, to the president of El Salvador for a moment and just follow up on a point that was raised by Antonia, and that is, on X, the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, responded to your statement condemning these strikes by saying, so you just want to defend thugs. Given his track record, and as others pointed out online, given his own track record, wouldn't the precedent that is being set right now by Donald Trump allow a future Democratic president in this country to say, hey, we have a warrant out for the arrest of President Bukele, and we're going to send Delta Force to go and get him from El Salvador for whatever charges we can drum up?
Absolutely. Watch what you ask for. And as I replied there, I said, you don't see me defending you, nor am I defending Maduro. The thing that neither Bukele nor Maduro respect is the rule of law. After all, Bukele is the guy who calls himself the world's coolest dictator. Meanwhile, he has essentially stripped people in El Salvador of many of their rights. He's locked people up in CICOT, which has become a torture chamber, as explained by human rights organizations. So, yes, watch what you ask for, because this would be a precedent for coming down to El Salvador and scooping up Bukele, who, by the way, there's lots of evidence that he himself collaborated with MS-13 to essentially prevent them from testifying against him. So, yes, watch what you ask for, President Bukele.
Yeah, he blocked or attempted to block the extradition of MS-13 leaders. That's a gang the Trump administration claims to be incredibly concerned about, too, here on U.S. soil. I want to ask you about what Democrats may or may not be able to do about all of this now. The Senate is a very chummy place. A lot of Democratic senators have had good, communicative relationships with Marco Rubio in the past. Is there someone, a Democrat, who can get to him and have a sort of face-to-face conversation with him about why Democrats have not been part of the briefings? Because it seems like he has let some Republicans in on some of the plans and the discussions of what's to come, and hold him accountable for kind of pushing Congress entirely aside here and leaving them to sort of abdicate their war powers and responsibilities. Is there a Democrat who can get to Marco Rubio, or at least what the old version of Marco Rubio once sort of seemed to be, to have that conversation?
Antonio, I don't know, not to my knowledge. I mean, and not because Democrats wouldn't want to try, but because Marco Rubio has undergone a full MAGA lobotomy. I mean, this used to be a guy who took to the Senate floor talking about human rights around the world, talking about democracy around the world. He's gone full MAGA. I mean, that is not part of his playbook because it's not part of Donald Trump's playbook. We should be pushing and we should be getting hearings. I mean, it is a total abdication of Republicans' constitutional duties as a separate branch of government in the Congress to not even have a hearing. We haven't had a hearing on Venezuela. This has been going on for a very long time now. And what we see is just signing over that blank check to Donald Trump. As I said, we're going to try another war powers resolution. Senator Rand Paul supported it last time, but I think maybe one other Republican did. Senator Merkley and I offered a motion in the last couple of weeks to say no American taxpayer dollars should be used to take military action against Venezuela. Again, blocked by Republicans. So Secretary Rubio and Republicans seem to be totally, 100% with Donald Trump when it comes to all of this. And they've thrown their belief in human rights and democracy, they've thrown it overboard. It's all about the oil in Venezuela right now.
Senator, I want to ask you really quickly before we go a slightly more political question, and it's based off of a post by Congressman Ro Khanna. He wrote yesterday about 2028 contenders among Democratic leaders. He said, the silence from many media hype 2028 contenders today is shocking. If you cannot oppose this regime change war for oil, you don't have the moral clarity or guts to lead our party or nation. Do you think some of the names that have been bounced, and I ask you this obviously because your name has come up as a possible contender in 2028 among Democrats, but how do you think the Democratic Party should be responding and the leaders of the Democratic Party should be responding to this regime change operation in Venezuela over oil?
Well, I agree with Ro Khanna. I think this is a moment, and we've had other moments, over the last months and years where it's a test as to whether or not Democrats are going to be willing to speak up and take a clear position on questions of war and peace, on questions of conscience. And this is one where, I think some people are, again, hedging their bets, trying to put their fingers in the wind. So I agree with Ro Khanna. I think the American people, whether they agree with you all the time or disagree with you, at the end of the day, they want somebody who's going to be straight with them and tell them where we all stand. And that's what we should all be doing.
Senator, very quickly with our last few seconds, do you think President Trump is serious about going after Greenland and Cuba next?
Look, I wouldn't count anything out. I do think Cuba is very much in the president and Marco Rubio's crosshairs. I think part of the motivation for Rubio in Venezuela has been the question of Cuba. And with Greenland, it's when we thought, the president wasn't going to be talking about it as much, here they go again. Right. So I've told our European allies and friends early on in this administration, believe what they say. And I think it's a moment where our European allies, people who still believe in democracy and human rights and the rule of law, really have to step up at this moment, because Republicans in Congress are clearly running away from their responsibilities. Obviously, 2026 will be an opportunity for the American people to weigh in, and I hope people will come out big time at the polls and let, as we saw a few weeks ago.
Senator Chris Van Hollen, thank you for joining us this evening.
Great to be with you.